So this lecture is about genes and experience, but really it's more than just genes and experience. A lot of this lecture has to do with dichotomies. In particular, we'll be looking at the physiological versus psychological dichotomy and the inherited versus learned dichotomy. We'll then get into talking about human evolution and behavior, and we'll be spending some time on the genetics of human psychological differences, which is actually one of the harder topics in the textbook. So, in general, people tend to reduce the complexities of our lives down to simple, mutually exclusive dichotomies. That is, we tend to think in terms of right versus wrong, good versus evil, etc. This tendency to think about the biology of behavior in terms of dichotomies is illustrated by two kinds of questions that people commonly ask. The first is whether it's physiological or psychological, that is, whether it's body, brain versus mind. And the second is whether it is inherited or it is learned. This is basically the nature-nurture dichotomy, so genes versus environment. The 17th century French philosopher Descartes is probably most famous for his statement, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. But he was also popularly known for Cartesian dualism. And according to Descartes, the universe is composed of two elements, physical matter and the human mind, soul or spirit. In his original conception, the body, including the brain, interacted with the mind via the pineal gland, which is basically depicted in his drawing right there. So the sort of teardrop-shaped structure in the middle of the individual's head is the pineal gland, according to Descartes. Now, the pineal gland is actually much smaller than that, and it sits at the base of the brain. Its location is believed to be one of the reasons why Descartes believed it to be the interface between the body and the mind. But there were other reasons as well. Most people now understand that human behavior has a physiological basis, but many still cling to the dualistic assumption that there are certain human activities that somehow transcend the human brain. So, for example, people will often talk about consciousness being generated by or conjured from the brain. And this is somewhat reminiscent of a Cartesian view, although it's not as strong a view as Cartesian dualism. So, talking, for example, about consciousness emerging from the brain as an emergent property is dualistic in nature, but is not necessarily Cartesian dualism. This is a quote from a science article published in 2006, and it illustrates the tendency to think in terms of the physiological versus psychological dichotomy. So this is actually from the abstract, or it actually might have been from the opening sentence. It might be the opening sentence from this paper. Although political views have been thought to arise largely from individual experiences, recent research suggests that they may have a biological basis. Now, the implication here is that we must choose between a biological account for political views and a psychological account, and that also biological accounts are somehow more important than psychological accounts. The question you have to ask yourself is, political views don't have a biological basis. What else could they possibly have as their basis? This is a quote from the article that you were assigned as a reading, the Hustvedt article from 2013. The man had myriad symptoms: headaches, a recurrence of odd smells, shortness of breath, fatigue, and seizures. After an EEG, he was told that his seizures were non-epileptic, the result of conversion disorder. I quote, "The head of neurology, Dr. Sams, came in and stated that everything was in my head and was all PTSD related. The patient was discharged and told to get physical therapy. If it is mental," he writes, "then why am I going to physical therapy for it?" So this illustrates, again, at least in the context of medicine, which was the focus of the Hustvedt article, the tendency to think in terms of the psychological versus physiological dichotomy. This is another quote from Hustvedt, but it's actually a quote from a book by Hurwitz and Pritchard published in 2006. Which provides definitions of various psychiatric conditions, and it defines conversion disorders as fixed beliefs of somatic dysfunction arising from psychological distress that control cortical and subcortical pathways to produce patterns of loss or gain of function that are not organic in the conventional sense. Husvet's point about conversion reactions or conversion disorders is that these things tend to be talked about in a relatively circular fashion, but yet they still reek of this physiological versus psychological dichotomy. Now, the whole point of the Husvet article and my request in asking you to read that article is, of course, to emphasize to you the importance of thinking about philosophical matters when considering behavioral neuroscience or biopsychology. Another example of the physiological versus psychological dichotomy is illustrated by the distinction that is often held between neurological disorders versus psychological disorders. So the reasoning goes that schizophrenia is associated with elevated dopamine levels, so therefore schizophrenia is a neurological disorder, a brain disorder, or an organic disorder. It's often frequently called a neuropsychiatric disorder, which basically blends the neurological versus psychological distinction. Now, there's a commonly held theory of schizophrenia known as the dopamine theory of schizophrenia, which we'll be talking about more and reading about more when we talk about psychiatric disorders in the second term of the course. But this is actually, the dopamine theory of schizophrenia is actually a classic misnaming of a theory. Just because we have a correlation between increased dopamine levels and schizophrenia, this doesn't mean we have a theory of schizophrenia per se. We have a theory of how biochemistry goes awry in schizophrenia. And a question I want to pose to you, and you should think about, is what is the difference between a psychiatric disorder and a neurological disorder? So what is the difference per se between depression and epilepsy? Does discovering a lesion or source of epilepsy in the brain make the illness more real than, let's say, depression? It's something to think about because there is still within the medical community the distinction between neurological disorders and psychiatric disorders. So many people with clinical depression can be effectively treated with a placebo, such as a sugar pill. The question I'm posing here is, does that mean the depression is all in their mind? Some people would say this, but we have to realize that placebos are actually have very powerful physiological effects. So if I gave you a sugar pill and your psychological disorder improved, what is the conclusion? That the effects were psychological, or that the illness was psychological? That it was all in your mind? And if you do say it's all in your mind, what does that really mean? Another question that's related is, why are placebos used as a control? Are they really a valid control condition? So the point I want to get to here is that placebos can have dramatic effects on physiology. So for example, there are known placebo effects within Parkinson's disease. So for example, you could give someone with Parkinson's disease a pill that looks very similar to the pill that they might take for their condition, which is typically L-DOPA, and in reality it's a placebo or sugar pill, and in response to that placebo, they will actually, if you measure dopamine efflux in their brain, you will see an increase of as much as 200%, which is telling you that the belief that one is taking a pill that is going to cause a physiological change is sufficient to actually cause a physiological change. A related issue is our dismissal of a treatment because it is not significantly better than placebo. So even when the placebo can be effective 30 to 40% of the time. So again, is it really fair to use a placebo when studying the effects of, let's say, antidepressant medications? Maybe we should be looking for better placebos as opposed to looking for comparing antidepressant medications to placebos. And ultimately, do we really need to know the mechanism to know that it is physiological? What else could it actually be? So why is this an important consideration? What are the implications of thinking in terms of a physiological versus psychological dichotomy? We know, for example, that dualistic thinking can affect clinical decision-making. For example, a recent survey found that mental health workers that believed in the mind-brain dichotomy, the physiological versus psychological dichotomy, were more likely to see their patients as being responsible for their condition. Now, the underlying assumption here with the physiological versus psychological dichotomy is that there is something that transcends biology and that something is capable of controlling behavior. So what is the evidence for this distinction? Now, before we move on, I want to emphasize that there are two principles of scientific thinking. One of them we already covered, the idea of scientific skepticism, and this is basically the approach where you start from a condition of non-belief and you're particularly skeptical of ideas that can be neither disproven or proven. A second principle of scientific thinking is Occam's razor, and Occam's razor basically says that the explanation of any phenomenon should make as few assumptions as possible. This is often paraphrased as, all other things being equal, the simplest solution is the best solution. A related law is Morgan's canon, which you read about in the textbook, and this was something that was coined by the 19th century British psychologist C. Lloyd Morgan. And it still remains a fundamental precept of comparative animal psychology. And here is Morgan's canon, a quote from Morgan himself. In no case is an animal activity to be interpreted in terms of higher psychological processes if it can be fairly interpreted in terms of processes which stand lower in the scale of psychological evolution and development. So, in general, when you're examining animal behavior, be it human or non-human, you should typically approach the analysis of that behavior by looking for the simplest explanation for that behavior. But an important question to ask yourself here is, this is largely a behaviorist approach to thinking about animal behavior, and it's important to ask, what is the simplest explanation? So why don't we, for example, when we look at non-human animals, why don't we assume consciousness as the simplest explanation for their behavior? Related to those previously mentioned two principles of scientific thinking, it's also important to realize that there are two acceptable kinds of evidence in science. The first is observation, and this is typically synonymous with data collection. So, for example, conducting an experiment and collecting data to provide evidence for a particular claim. The second is logical argument, and it's important to realize that the latter can be just as powerful as the former. So, for example, on the exams in this course, on the short answer questions, you might be asked to provide evidence to support a particular claim, be it your own or be it another researcher's. You can provide evidence in two formats. So you can provide evidence based on experiments that you read about or that were presented in lecture, or you can provide a logical argument, or you can provide both, which is the best possible scenario. So there are really two key aspects to Cartesian dualism. The first is that the brain is not capable of very complex things, so there must be a mind. The second aspect of Cartesian dualism is that only humans have minds and only humans can think. So let's address the first aspect of Cartesian dualism, which basically says that complex cognitions can't be supported by the brain, so they must be supported by the mind. Now, it's important to realize that even the most complex of human cognitions can be affected by damage or stimulation to parts of the brain. And we'll see this time and time again throughout this course. And all I'm going to do right now is just provide an example of one sort of human cognition that can be affected by brain damage that's fairly complex in nature. So, asomatagnosia refers to a disorder where the patient has a deficiency in the awareness of parts of one side of their own body. And this disorder typically results from combined right temporoparietal and right medial frontal lesions and affects the left side of the body, that is the contralateral side of the body. So we're talking about the right temporoparietal region would be right there, and the right medial frontal lesion would be hidden behind this side of the frontal lobe, would be closer to the medial aspect of the brain. So this is a quote from Oliver Sacks. "When I arrived, I found the patient lying on the floor by his bed and staring at one leg. 'Look at it,' he cried with revulsion in his face. 'Have you ever seen such a creepy, horrible thing? I thought a cadaver was just dead, but this is uncanny, and somehow it's ghastly. It seems stuck to me.' He seized it with both hands with extraordinary violence and tried to tear it off his body, and failing, punched it. 'Easy,' I said. 'Be calm. Take it easy. I wouldn't punch that leg like that.' 'And why not?' he asked. 'Because it's your leg,' I answered. 'Don't you know your own leg?' How can a thing like that belong to me? I don't know where such a thing belongs. His voice trailed off. He looked terrified and shocked. So this quote is basically illustrating an instance of asomatagnosia, which is essentially a deficiency in the awareness of one's own body part. In this case, this individual does not recognize his own leg as being his own leg, and actually throws it out of the bed. He actually has not only asomatagnosia, but he has a condition known as somatoparaphrenia. somatoparaphrenia. So somatoparaphrenia is basically a somatagnosia with delusions. And in this case, the individual's delusion is that the leg is actually a cadaver's leg, that it's actually somebody else's leg attached to him. Other cases of asomatagnosia might not involve the actual perception of an alien limb being attached to oneself. So, for example, in this case, which was a case study published by Arzi et al. Back in 2006, and I'm actually pretty sure that the individual who is the lead author of this paper was actually the individual who was the source of the case study. So what happened here was that the individual in question that formed the basis of the case study was sitting in front of her computer, and she felt suddenly dizzy. And at that point, she felt that parts of her left arm had disappeared. So that's depicted right here. So this is basically a time lapse. So you can see she drew her hand when she started to feel dizzy, and then moments later, the front part of her arm and hand disappeared, and she could actually see the table where her hand should have been. And this is an example of visual completion, which you'll read about more in chapter 6. So our brains tend to fill in gaps in our visual field, and the best example of this, of course, is our blind spot, which you're probably already aware of. That is, as time progressed, as you can see in this timeline, eventually parts of her hand started to reappear as she was sitting in front of the computer. This is over the course of minutes, and at one point there were actually two holes that she could see through her hand and see the table underneath it. Eventually those two holes merged into one hole, and then finally the hole disappeared and her hand returned to visibility. She also, it's important to realize, felt that part of her left arm and hand had disappeared. When she actually went to see a neurologist about this instance, which was presumably due to a stroke, they actually found two ischemic, that is, stroke-based lesions in her right premotor cortex. That's actually depicted here. So this is an MRI of her brain, and what it shows you is that basically there were two lesions that occurred, which I think is quite interesting, because if you look back at this image, there's at one point a point in her experience where there were two holes in her hand. And what's interesting about this is that where the lesions were was actually in the motor strip, corresponding quite closely to the hand representation. So this is a drawing based on Penfield's homunculus, which you saw in during the first class. And the lesions that you see here correspond roughly with where the location was of the holes in her hand. So that's quite interesting. So in summary, it's important to realize that very complex human cognitions, in this case self-awareness or awareness of one's own body parts, can be affected by brain damage. Now we'll deal with the next issue related to Cartesian dualism, the idea that non-human animals aren't capable of psychological processes that are considered human. In fact, many non-human species possess psychological processes that are commonly considered as human, and we're going to look at one particular type of psychological process that's typically considered of human, and this is self-recognition. So it's actually related to the previous case of asomotagnosia that we just talked about. Now, the mirror self-recognition test was actually developed by the researcher by the name of Gallup, Gallup, as a means of testing whether or not an animal can actually recognize themselves in a mirror. Okay, so this is an example of self-recognition. Gallup, I think, at one point claimed that this was an example of self-awareness. People have tempered it down to just saying this is an example of self-recognition. So in the mirror self-recognition test in chimpanzees, which is the first species that it was done in, mirrors are first introduced into the cages of chimpanzees and their behavior is observed. Then, after a period of time, the chimpanzees are anesthetized and a colored spot is painted on one of their brows. So what is the reaction to the red spot? So this image, for example, shows you a picture of a chimpanzee after it's been anesthetized and had a red spot applied to its eyebrow. And you can see that it's basically touching it as it's looking in the mirror. Now, when chimpanzees are first exposed to a mirror, the first response they have to a mirror is actually a social one. So they will basically treat their reflection in the mirror as if it was another chimpanzee. And then they move into a period where they seem to be testing the correlation of movement that exists in the mirror when they move in front of it. So they will, for example, move back and forth and see if the image in the mirror also moves back and forth. The next phase that occurs when they're exposed to the mirror is that they use the mirror to groom and inspect their various body parts and even play with their face in the mirror and assume unusual postures. But the critical test is the mirror self-recognition test, which involves the application of something to a part of the body of the animal that they can't see normally if they don't have a mirror, but can see when they do have a mirror. Human children also don't pass this test initially, so it takes them between 15 to 24 months before they pass the mirror self-recognition tests. And it's important to realize that many other species have actually passed the mirror self-recognition test. So most of the great apes, such as humans, bonobos, chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas, bottlenose dolphins have also passed the test, killer whales, elephants, though it should be tempered by the fact that only 1 in 3 Asian elephants actually pass the test, and European magpies. European magpies are from the corvid family, which includes crows, ravens, jays, and magpies. With respect to chimpanzees, it's important to note that in Gallup's original studies, only between 43 to 75% of the chimpanzees actually passed the test. And there are some criticisms of the mirror self-recognition test. So, for example, primates have hands that they groom themselves and others with. So it might not be fair to be applying this test to animals that don't have hands to groom themselves and others with, or animals, for example, that don't tend to groom themselves as frequently. A second issue with the mirror self-recognition test is that chimpanzees will often check their bodies after seeing a conspecific with an unusual mark on its body. So if a chimpanzee sees another chimpanzee with an unusual mark on its body, it will check its own body to see if it also has that same mark. So in essence, no self-recognition is actually required to actually pass the test. All that is required is that the monkey responds in a social manner to the reflection in the mirror. A third issue is that sometimes chimps who have passed the test will, upon later observation, actually look behind the mirror to see if there exists a chimpanzee behind the glass that's in front of them. And we also know that for most animals, controlling a visual stimulus is rewarding and does not require self-recognition. So for example, macaque monkeys will preferentially watch a human who is imitating them. So this graph shows you a summary of when people believe self-recognition as assessed through the mirror self-recognition test, if you indeed buy the argument that it is a measure of self-recognition. This graph shows you basically when during the course of evolution it is believed that self-recognition emerged. Now we know that gorillas, humans, chimpanzees, and orangutans have all passed the test, whereas gibbons and old world monkeys have not. So it's believed that about 15 million years ago there was the emergence of this facet of self-recognition amongst primates. But as I mentioned, other species beyond the primates have actually passed the mirror self-recognition test, and a good example of this are Asian elephants. Now, it's important to realize that in this study that was done by Plotnick et al. Back in 2006, only one of the 3 Asian elephants actually passed the test. And what they did in this study was they basically put a mirror in the enclosure in which these Asian elephants were housed. And you can see that mirror here. So this elephant is actually looking at its reflection in the mirror. I'm going to show you quickly some videos of the elephants. So this, for example, is when the mirror is first introduced into the enclosure. So what you can see here is that the elephant is basically reaching behind with its trunk, behind where the mirror is, presumably to see if there's another elephant there or another entity there by feeling around with its trunk. It even gets up on its hind legs and tries to look over to see if there's another elephant there. Now, just like with chimpanzees, elephants go through stages in terms of their behavior in front of this mirror. And this is sort of another view of the mirror in the same study, and it shows you an elephant approaching the mirror and then engaging in movements and looking for correlated movement in the reflection that they see. Okay, so this elephant is essentially playing in front of the mirror. It's moving back and forth, moving its trunk, swinging its trunk, and looking to see, presumably, if there is actually a correlated movement present in the mirror. Now, the last video from this study that I'm going to show you is actually an elephant that is being subject to the critical test, the mirror self-recognition test, where they placed a white mark in the shape of an X, you can see here, on its brow. And you can see what happens when the elephant actually approaches the mirror with this mark on its brow. So it's basically quite cutely, it's trying to touch the white mark on its brow with its trunk, and you'll see it over the next few seconds winding up its trunk to try to reach it. So here it goes for the wind up, swing, swing, touch. Again, it's trying to touch that mark on its brow, and it keeps trying to do that after it sees itself in the mirror. So Asian elephants, at least one Asian elephant has passed this test. Another species that's passed this test is the European magpie, which is part of the corvid family. And I've placed links to a video that shows you just how brilliant the members of the corvid family are. So, for example, there's a video about Japanese crows who have developed a very unique skill, presumably through social learning, a method for cracking nuts that are otherwise uncrackable, and even very complex means of actually collecting those cracked nuts once they're cracked. And if you watch the video, you'll see what I mean. I can't include it in this video because it is copyright material from BBC. And if I try to upload copyright material in a video that I'm recording, YouTube will basically spit it back to me and say there's copyright material and we can't upload your video. So I've put links on the course website instead. So this is, again, a picture of a European magpie that has actually the mark that is critical for the test. So that yellow dot underneath its chin is basically, underneath its beak, is basically the mark that is used to test it in front of a mirror. And only some of the European magpies passed the test, but it was quite remarkable for those that did just how clear the behavior was in terms of it trying to remove the mark. Should also mention that many of the studies that have used the mirror self-recognition test have not really had a proper control in place. So previous studies prior to this one by Pryor et al. Were actually never used a control situation where they placed a mark on an animal that was invisible but otherwise had the same scent. So in this study by Pryor et al. With the European magpies, they actually had a control condition where they placed a mark using the same ink under the beak of a control group of magpies. And in that case, the animals did not, when exposed to the mirror, they did not try to make efforts to remove the mark. So for centuries, people have debated whether humans and other animals inherit their behavioral capacities or whether they acquire them through learning. This debate is commonly known as the nature-nurture issue, and it is epitomized by the battle that existed between the North American behaviorists, epitomized, for example, by John Watson, versus the European ethologists, epitomized by Konrad Lorenz. It has been argued since then that behavior always develops under the combined control of both genes and the environment. So more recently, the question of whether something is due to genetic factors or the environment has mutated into a different question. And that question is a matter of how much. That is, how much of something, let's say intelligence, is genetic and how much of it is the result of experience. This new question is based on a premise that genes and environment combine in an additive fashion rather than through an interactive process. So examples of this new version of the dichotomy would be asking how much of major depressive disorder is due to genes and how much of it is due to environment or learning. Another example is how much of language abilities is due to genes and how much is due to environment, and how much of one's intelligence is due to genes and how much of one's intelligence is due to environment. So this metaphor is in the text, and metaphors can be very useful to help you illustrate, think clearly about particular issues. So this metaphor is that music is made through an interactive process between the player and an instrument. And it would be silly to ask the question how much of the music was made by the musician and how much was made by the instrument. Likewise, it's somewhat silly to ask how much of a behavior is due to the genes and how much is due to environment, since an organism can never develop without the combination and interaction of both factors. So this is a diagram actually taken from the previous edition of your text, but there's a similar diagram in your text, which basically shows you that development occurs through the interaction of genes and experience. That interaction of genes and experience affects the expression of genes. So this is the field known as epigenetics, which is talked about in the other video that I referred you to. So again, epigenetics is basically any changes in phenotype caused by any means other than changes in the underlying DNA sequence, such as, for example, DNA methylation or histone modifications. Again, this is talked about in more detail in the other video. So now we're going to move on to the topic of how to think clearly about human evolution. And we'll be going through 7 often misunderstood points about evolution. Some of them will be obvious to you, some of them less obvious. The first is that humans are not higher up on the evolutionary tree, or more appropriately, bush. We are the last surviving species of a family, that is, the hominids, that has existed for a very short period of time. So this diagram, which is available online, is actually quite a beautiful diagram that shows you the course of evolution of species dating back to the time at which the first organisms actually appeared on the planet Earth. And what it doesn't show you, and what's important to realize, is that only a few of those species that have gone extinct are shown. If you actually included all the species that have gone extinct, the diagram would be impossibly large and you wouldn't even be able to fit it. This is large enough as it is. Now, we've only existed on this planet for a very short period of time, so if you zoom in on this diagram, what you'll see is where we are way down here. That's how long we've been around compared to, let's say, other organisms such as fish or bacterium that have been around for much longer. So to think that we are in some way evolutionarily more capable or more adapted to our environment is not necessarily correct. We've been around for such a short period of time, it's hard to know how long we'll actually last for. The second point is that fewer than 1% of the products, that is, species of evolution, still exist today. So this diagram here shows you the decimation and diversification model, which was developed by Stephen Jay Gould, a famous evolutionary biologist. And what it's showing you is that the majority of species during the course of evolution have become extinct. And as stated earlier, fewer than 1% of the species that have arisen during the course of evolution still exist today. Evolution is commonly thought to be a slow, gradual process, yet we know that rapid evolutionary changes can be triggered by sudden changes in the environment. And there are evolutionary biologists now who are studying such changes occurring in organisms within the course of several generations even. And this image here shows you the distinction between what's known as the gradualism model, where you have gradual speciation, versus the punctuated equilibrium model, which has more dramatic emergence of species over the course of time. And the fourth thing is that evolution does not progress to perfection. So sometimes thought that evolution is working towards some degree of perfection. The designs themselves are never perfect. This is because it's sort of a hit and miss issue. Now, this species that's depicted in this image here is known as the blobfish. The blobfish was discovered, I think, about 8 to 10 years ago in the oceans off the coast of Australia, in a very deep part of the ocean. And this species has virtually no musculature. It basically just floats around like a blob, hence the name blobfish, with its mouth open, basically swallowing any organisms that happen to swim into its mouth while it's floating around. I put it here not because it's an example of a lack of perfection. In fact, it's actually perfectly adapted to its environment. What's important to realize is that evolution progresses based on the current environmental conditions, and it's not always true that the environment will stay the same, and therefore the designs will never be perfect. The fifth point is that not all existing behaviors or structures are adaptive. So sometimes structures or behaviors appear as the byproduct of other adaptive structures or behaviors. Such byproducts have been termed spandrels, and the term spandrel comes from basically the space that exists between columns and arches. It's an architectural term. Over time, people have turned these spaces into decorative areas, but they don't actually serve any engineering purpose. Now, a good example of a spandrel is the belly button. The belly button, of course, is a leftover from the umbilical cord that attaches the baby to the mother during gestation, and once the umbilical cord is cut at birth or removed, the belly button is what remains of it. So the belly button is a spandrel that results from the adaptive structure known as the umbilical cord. Another point is that not all existing adaptive characteristics evolved to perform their current function. So some adaptive characteristics, known as exaptations, evolved to perform one function and then were later co-opted to perform another. So for example, feathers are considered to be exaptations because they're believed to have first evolved for heat regulation, were later co-opted for flight. The last point is that similarities between species do not necessarily mean that the species have common evolutionary origins. Structures that are similar because they have a common evolutionary origin are termed homologous. So for example, a bat's wing and a human arm are considered to be homologous structures because they arose from a common evolutionary origin. Structures that are similar but do not have a common evolutionary origin are termed analogous. So for example, a bird's wing and a bee's wing are analogous structures. They didn't arise through a common evolutionary source, but they perform the same adaptive function, which is of course flight. So some behaviors play an obvious role in evolution, for example, food finding ability, avoiding predators, etc. Others play a less obvious role. So one less obvious example are courtship displays. Often an intricate series of courtship displays precedes copulation in many species. Courtship displays are thought to promote the evolution of new species. And recall, a species is a group of organisms that is reproductively isolated from other organisms. Isolation can result from a geographic barrier or a behavioral barrier. And you'll see from the videos I've posted online, ones from a David Attenborough show from BBC, that courtship displays can be quite different from one bird species to another in the case of the videos posted. Another great example is the lyrebird, which has a particular call that it uses for promoting itself to females of the species. The lyrebird is a remarkable bird because it can imitate sounds that you would otherwise think a bird incapable of, like chainsaws and other sounds from human activities, for example, car alarms as well. Again, you'll see that from the video that I posted. Now, we're going to move on to the genetics of human psychological differences. And in individuals, recall that we already talked that music is the product of an interaction between the musician and the instrument, and we cannot ask what proportion of that music is from the instrument and what proportion is from the musician. Likewise, the intelligence of an individual is the product of an interaction between that individual's genes and their environment. We cannot ask what proportion of their intelligence is due to their genes and what proportion is due to their environment. Now, the situation changes a bit when you're talking about groups of individuals. So let's say we have many musicians and we measure the quality of their music. We can now ask what proportion of the difference between these musicians is due to differences between their instruments and what proportion is due to differences between their music skills. Similarly, if you ask the same question about intelligence, you can ask the question, what proportion of the difference between these individuals is due to differences between their environments and what proportion is due to differences between their genetic inheritances? And that's the basis of what behavioral geneticists do, is they basically ask questions about proportions of differences between individuals due to genetics versus environment. In order to assess the relative contributions of genes and environment to the development of differences in some trait, behavioral geneticists study individuals with known genetic similarity. For example, they might compare monozygotic twins to dizygotic twins. Monozygotic twins, which were previously called identical twins, but that's incorrect because no set of twins is perfectly identical, is monozygotic twins result when one egg is fertilized and forms one zygote, which then divides into two embryos. A dizygotic twin results from two fertilized eggs that are implanted in the uterus wall at the same time. So from two different sperm cells, essentially, and two different eggs. So monozygotic twins raised in a family share 100% of their genes and also share their environment. So any differences between them are presumed to be due to non-shared environmental effects. And non-shared environmental effects can include just about anything. It's sort of the dark matter of the behavioral geneticist world. Non-shared environmental effects might include, for example, one monozygotic twin taking a tumble down the stairs and hitting their head at the age of 4, let's say, while the other monozygotic twin doesn't. And as a result of that non-shared environmental effect, that is the banging of their head, that has a snowball effect that basically affects their experiences with the environment going forward. So in general, non-shared environmental effects get larger and larger between monozygotic twins as their lives progress. Dizygotic twins also have a common shared environment and share about 50% of their genes. Heritability estimates are numerical estimates of the proportion of the variance observed on a trait that was due to genetic variation within a particular study. Okay, so one might say, for example, the heritability estimate for intelligence is 70%. It would be wrong from such a statement to conclude that the trait in question is 70% genetic, but unfortunately that's how the newspapers and popular press commonly report these things. So if a behavioral geneticist publishes a study where they publish a heritability estimate, it is taken to mean by some individuals that the trait in question is 70% genetic. But a heritability estimate is not a measure of how much of something is genetic. It's a measure of the proportion of variance observed on a trait that was due to genetic variation within that particular study. It is essentially a descriptive statistic. It is not an inferential statistic that can be applied to the population as a whole. So this study, which is talked about briefly in your text, is a study that was done by Turkheimer et al. Back in 2003, where they looked at heritability estimates. Now, heritability estimates have been calculated for intelligence, in particular the IQ test, for ages. And typically people find IQs, heritability estimates for IQ that are in the range of about 50 to 60%, some as high as 70%. And what these graphs show you are basically the 3 components that behavioral geneticists break up the variance that exists between individuals within their study. So for example, the monozygotic and dizygotic twins, for example. So the first thing is the heritability estimate, which is often called which is part of the ACE model, ACE model. There's the shared environment, and then there's the non-shared environment. What Turkheimer and colleagues did is they were wondering why there was such variance in the heritability estimates for the IQ test. And so what they did is they looked at 320 pairs of 7-year-old twins across the full spectrum of socioeconomic status levels. So ranging from the lowest socioeconomic status to the highest socioeconomic status. And they used nonlinear modeling, which is too complex to explain in this context, to reach their conclusions. And what they found was that if you just look at the graph on the far left, this graph, which is a graph of the heritability estimate, on the x-axis you have socioeconomic status, and on the y-axis you have proportion of variance. What they found, and the proportion of variance is essentially the heritability estimate. So it's the proportion of variance in IQ that is attributable to genetic factors. So in this case, heritability estimate varies as a function of socioeconomic status. Where you have a very low socioeconomic status, the heritability estimate approaches 0. Where you have a very high socioeconomic status, the heritability estimate approaches 1 or 0.9. If you look at the middle socioeconomic status, let's say around the 50% mark, 50 to 60% mark, that's typical heritability estimate that you get, which is about 50 to 60%. Okay? Now, what's important to realize from these graphs, which break up the variance that exists between the intelligence of a group of individuals into heritability estimate, shared environment, and non-shared environment, is that for any point on the socioeconomic status x-axis, you will see that the total variance will add up to 1. Okay, so for example, if we look at the 40% mark, you have about 0.2 proportion of the variance explained through genetic factors. You have about 0.5%, which is explained through shared environmental factors, and you have about 0.3%, which is 0.3, which is explained through non-shared environmental factors. So if you add those up, 0.2, 0.5, and 0.3, it adds up to 1. So for any point along these graphs, the total proportion of variance will add up to 1. Okay? Now that's how behavioral geneticists parse variance that exists within a particular study. They parse it into a heritability estimate, that is the proportion of variance between individuals that can be explained based on genetic factors, the proportion of variance that can be explained based on shared environment, and the proportion of variance which can be explained based on non-shared environment. The non-shared environment is essentially the error term. So it's basically what's left over once they account for known genetic variance and known shared environmental factors. So why, the question from this study is, why would you have the heritability estimate varying so dramatically as a function of socioeconomic status? Now, we can think about this in a number of ways. The way that Turkheimer and colleagues, and Turkheimer is a very renowned behavioral geneticist, by the way. Turkheimer and colleagues conceptualize this as we each have basically a maximum potential IQ based on our genetic factors. And if you, let's say, are born with a potential IQ of 160, and you are put in a high socioeconomic status environment, you will likely achieve an IQ of 150 to 160 because there is relatively low variance in high socioeconomic status environments. If you are put in a low socioeconomic status environment, you might achieve an IQ somewhere between 100 to 160. That is, there will be high variance in the outcome IQ, which will result in a lower heritability estimate. So for example, in this study, which looked at, again, 7-year-old twins across this full spectrum of socioeconomic statuses, you can see that at low socioeconomic status, the shared environment accounts for 0.6 of the proportion of variance that exists between the twins, and for high socioeconomic status, the proportion of variance explained by the shared environment is approaching 0. So the main point of the Turkheimer study is that heritability estimates are essentially meaningless without knowing who your participants are in the study in question. Now, to summarize, I actually quite like this quote by Helen Maccabee. This quote basically says that the size of a heritability estimate cannot be generalized from the specific population in its specific environment assessed with the specific set of measures used in that study. So it would be very wrong to read a behavioral geneticist study and read the heritability estimate, let's say, that says that the heritability estimate is 0.5, and then conclude that for the general population, that trait in question is 50% genetic, which is commonly done, unfortunately. It's created such confusion that in 2010, Turkheimer and a large number of other high-profile behavioral geneticists wrote a paper that argued for the complete abandonment of heritability estimates. And since then, the number of studies that have actually been published with heritability estimates has declined dramatically. Their argument is that we know genetics contributes to any behavior, and that the heritability estimate is flawed as an estimate of heritability. So if twin studies are no longer useful for the calculation of heritability estimates, can they be used for anything? Well, Turkheimer and colleagues in that same paper in 2010 argued that phenotypically discordant monozygotic twin studies are actually very useful. A phenotypically discordant monozygotic twin study is one where you have a trait in two monozygotic twins that is different. So for example, if one monozygotic twin has, let's say, schizophrenia and the other does not, you would then be able to identify epigenetic factors associated with the illness, because we would know, since their genes are identical, that there must be some epigenetic factor, which is due to the interaction, of course, between genes and environment, which is associated with the illness in question. Now, it could be schizophrenia, it could be any illness. So just a reminder for next day, which is actually Wednesday, to please read Chapter 3 and complete the Rebel assignments for Chapter 3.